They laughed when she stepped onto the range, called her HR, joked about curling irons and flip phones. Just another washed-up contractor, they thought. Then she fired. Not flashy, not loud, just 10 shots so tight they looked punched through by a machine. And when the wind tugged up her sleeve, a tattoo emerged, faded, black, unmistakable. The mark of Shadow Company. That's when the SEAL team froze. Because legends don't need introductions. They just show up and let the silence speak. If this gave you chills, subscribe now, because we bring the untold stories of real warriors back to light. The sun at Camp Brightstone had a way of making everything look harsh. Edges sharpened, colors bleached, even the shadows felt like they were sweating. By 830, the firing range shimmered under a pale sky, heat rising off the concrete in waves. Diesel fumes clung low over the ground like a bad memory. Sergeant Lorna Briggs stepped onto the range without ceremony, her boots quiet against the pitted concrete. She wore plain contractor gear-faded cargo pants, a dark gray quarter-zip too thin for field use, and a sun-bleached ball cap pulled low. No patches, no unit identifiers. Just a laminated clearance badge clipped to her hip that flapped once with the wind before settling into silence. Her eyes scanned the lanes briefly, not nervously calculated. Like she was mapping cover and distance out of habit, not fear. The instructors clocked her immediately. Hendricks nudged Morales with an elbow and leaned against the rust-streaked barrel by the armory shed. "Check her stance already," he muttered. "She's holding that carbine like a curling iron." Morales smirked, arms crossed. "Contractor. Probably here on some regular paperwork. Finance division, maybe. HR." He said it like a curse. "Watch, she'll ask how to unfold the bipod." A pair of reservists a few lanes down laughed a little too loud, the kind of laugh young men use to insulate themselves from their own mediocrity. One of them tilted his head toward Briggs as she set her range bag on the bench. "She's gotta be what, 40? Bet she hasn't touched a trigger since flip phones." The words drifted out across the range like smoke, casual, careless, stinging without drawing blood. Briggs didn't blink, didn't look up. Just opened the flap on her bag and started unpacking with quiet efficiency. She moved like someone assembling a puzzle she'd solved 1,000 times before. But deep in her jaw, a subtle shift. Just a twitch of tension, barely visible. Not anger, no shame, recognition. She knew this moment. I knew it too well. The routine hadn't changed. The voices hadn't changed. Only the names. She slid a battered shooting mat across the concrete and knelt without a sound. Let them laugh. She wasn't here to talk. Lane 13 sat at the edge of the range, just past the rusted floodlight pole and too close to the latrine vents that hummed with rot and bleach. It was where they sent the ones they didn't want to deal with. The late sign-ins, the screw-ups, the ones who wouldn't be missed if they left with bruised pride and a failed qualification sheet. It had bad lighting, a warped bench that sloped just enough to mess with your kit, and an uneven stretch of concrete that made a solid stance feel like a gamble. Everyone knew what it meant to be assigned Lane 13. Briggs didn't ask questions. She just nodded once at the corporal's clipped direction and made her way down range. No drag in her step, no signs of offense, but she knew exactly what it meant. She'd been reading those signals her whole life. She laid her range bag on the bench without flour, the old canvas whispering as it settled. It wasn't high speed. No molly straps or Velcro patches or flashy morale tags. Just a scuffed, plain duffel with corners softened by time. She unzipped it carefully, pulling the teeth apart like she didn't want to wake something sleeping inside. What she pulled out didn't look like much. A hand-oiled sling, its stitching burnished and dark. A set of soft leather gloves, their fingertips reinforced with worn padding. A compact cloth roll of tools, each piece wrapped in its own pocket, arranged with surgeon-like precision. No tricked-out gear, no flashy optics, No name-brand accessories. Just what worked. She laid everything out methodically, aligning each item with subtle care. It wasn't for show. It was a ritual. The kind that sinks into your bones after enough repetitions under enough duress. The kind of setup you do not to impress anyone, but because your life once depended on it being right the first time. Behind her, laughter still echoed faintly from the reservists, growing distant as if the air itself had decided to ignore them. Briggs sat back on her heels, fingers resting on the edge of the bench, eyes forward, calm, steady. And deep inside her, something old shifted. A memory not of sound, but of rhythm, stance, breath, pressure. She hadn't come to qualify. She'd come to remember who she used to be. The tone sounded overhead sharp, sterile, the official start of live fire. Lane lights blinked red to green. Targets flicked up in unison downrange, their silhouettes half faded from years of sun and sand. Lorna didn't hesitate. She raised the carbine, settled into her stance like she'd never left it, and pulled the trigger. The first shot cracked across the heat-heavy air, a clean break, no tremble, no overcorrection. The bullet struck low and left, outside the center ring but still on paper. Enough to pass. Enough to dismiss. Not enough to silence anyone who'd already made up their mind. A faint snort came from Lane 11. She flinched, a corporal said, voice just loud enough to carry. Might as well call that a courtesy shot. No one laughed outright, but the grins were there. Crooked. Safe. The kind of smiles people wear when they think the outcome's already decided. Lorna didn't look their way. Her breathing stayed even. No sighs, no tension. Just a slow exhale through her nose as she let the rifle settle back into a ready hold. She shifted her feet not much, just an inch's worth of correction, rolled her shoulder slightly to pull the sling tighter against the stock, let her cheek fall into place on the comb like it belonged there, like it had been there yesterday, like every day before. The second shot came smoother, a clean rhythm of breath and pull, recoil and recovery. This time the round punched closer to center right on the edge of the inner ring. No one said anything. She fired again, and again, and again. Each shot is an adjustment. Each correction is almost invisible. By the fifth round, a tight pattern had formed around the bullseye, perfect but intentional. A hand's-width grouping that spoke of discipline, not luck. Of someone not trying to prove anything, just trying to wake up old instincts, like brushing dust off a mirror that still remembered how to reflect light. Somewhere to her left, a rifle jammed, and someone cursed under their breath. But Lane 13 was quiet, still, a tempo all its own. Lorna lowered her rifle slowly, hands steady, shoulders loose. She wasn't in a hurry. The real calibration had just begun. The second string started without ceremony. No muttered countdown, no dramatic breath. Just the soft stretch of leather tightening over Lorna's knuckles as she adjusted her gloves, settled into position, and pressed the stock against her shoulder like returning to an old confession. Crack. The sixth shot snapped out with the same clean violence as the others, but this one didn't drift. It punched through center mass, exactly where it needed to be. Not luck, not guesswork. Just correction quiet, deliberate, precise. She adjusted nothing. The seventh shot landed half an inch away, so close the paper barely fluttered between impacts. 8th, 9th, 10th center, center, center. The group formed a tight cluster no larger than a silver dollar. Ghost grouping. The kind of tight surgical pattern that never came from panic or drills or borrowed training. It came from repetition burned into the marrow, from years of trigger time when every missed round could mean someone else's funeral. Down the line, the idle commentary faltered. Morales paused mid-sip, coffee sloshing in a paper cup, forgotten. Hendricks stopped checking his clipboard and leaned just slightly, to get a clearer view of her target screen. The reservist who made the curling iron joke now stared straight ahead, suddenly fascinated by the safety on his own rifle. No one said a word, but the silence had weight now. Not reverence, just uncertainty. They didn't know what they were looking at. Not yet. But they understood it wasn't normal. A few more rounds whispered out from lane 13, each one snapping into the black center with unbroken rhythm. Lorna's breathing stayed calm. Hands relaxed. No wasted movement. She wasn't showing off. Wasn't even reacting. She was just doing what she did. And that was when it happened, when the light caught the edge of her left sleeve as she reached forward for a fresh mag. The glove pulled back an inch, enough to reveal ink. Not decorative, not new. A black trident, faded and sharp, ghosted across her wrist. Crossed long rifles beneath it. Morales blinked. Hendricks leaned forward. Someone, somewhere, exhaled too hard. "What the hell kind of tattoo is that?" a young private whispered. But Lorna didn't flinch. She never did. Lorna reloaded, with the same quiet cadence she'd shown since stepping onto the Lenino-wasted motion. No pause between action and intent. The empty magazine dropped to the mat with a soft thud, and her fingers found the next without looking. She seated it cleanly, chambered around, and exhaled. That breath had the weight of ritual, not fatigue. But as she moved, her sleeve rode up slightly, catching at the wrist where the glove cuff had curled. A glimpse, just a flicker of black ink beneath pale skin. The heat had flushed color from her forearms, but the tattoo stood in stark contrast. Sharp lines. A trident. Unmistakable. Two crossed long rifles underneath, inked with care and intent. No frills. No shading. Just purpose. Morales saw it first. He narrowed his eyes, stepped forward an inch. Like that would help bring the shape into focus. "Did you see that?" he murmured, voice half caught in disbelief. Hendricks didn't answer. He was already squinting, already replaying the last 2 minutes in his mind, how her grouping had tightened without effort, how her posture hadn't shifted under pressure. Now the ink made it harder to pretend it was just muscle memory from ROTC days or some fluke shot string from a lucky civilian. That tattoo wasn't something you got off base. It wasn't something you copied off Pinterest or saw on a t-shirt at the PX. It wasn't fashionable. It wasn't fake. It was earned. Old school recon style. Pre-digitization. Back when they inked them in safe houses and desert fobs, sometimes with sterilized wire and boot polish, because real operators didn't have time to wait for clean needles. It was tribal, but not cultural operational. The kind of mark that said, you belong to something, and that something didn't want to be remembered. It wasn't supposed to be worn by someone like her. Not someone in off-the-shelf sneakers and a clearance badge. Not someone without command insignia or war stories folded into the creases of their uniform. And definitely not someone who'd just been assigned Lane 13. The line stayed quiet now. Even the wind seemed to pull back. Lorna didn't notice. Or maybe she did but didn't care. She rolled her sleeve down again without hurry and returned to her stance, the mark half fading back into shadow. But the silence she left in its wake said more than any shot she'd fired. The sound of tires crunching gravel announced the Humvee before anyone saw it. Its matte paint was sun-worn, the edges dulled by time and use. No sirens, no flags. Just presence, the kind of vehicle that didn't need to speak loudly to own the ground it rolled over. The range staff looked up as it came to a halt near the equipment shed. Doors opened almost in sync, and 6 men stepped out together. No swagger, no wasted motion, just quiet authority worn like armor. Their uniforms were regulated, but lived in. Patches sun-faded. Sleeves rolled with the same consistency you'd see in every combat zone, from Kandahar to coastal Syria. No one had to announce it. Naval Special Warfare. SEALs. The instructors straightened instinctively. Hendricks pushed his clipboard under his arm. Morales dropped the last of his coffee into the sand behind him, as if hiding it would make the moment cleaner. These weren't weekend warriors. These weren't officers looking for promotion points. These were the real things. The kind of men who moved like weight had consequences. They weren't supposed to be here today. Probably a change in scheduling. Advanced range qualifications. Most likely a refresher. But none of that mattered. Because one of them had stopped mid-stride. Chief Petty Officer Darnell Reyes. Mid-40s. Square jaw. Crow's feet etched by more sandstorms than birthdays. Scar over his left eyebrow. Healed without vanity. He carried his rifle like it was an extension of his ribs, natural, unshowy. He'd been walking toward the firing line with the rest of the team when his eyes locked on Lane 13, and he stopped. Cold. Didn't speak. Didn't blink. Just stared. Briggs had just finished her second magazine, standing relaxed, her weapon at rest. She hadn't noticed them arrive. Or maybe she had. Her expression didn't change. But Reyes's whole posture shifted. The tilt of the head, the barely perceptible tightening of the jaw. He looked at her like someone seeing a ghost rise out of desert dust. Not disbelief, recognition. "Son of a bitch," he murmured, low and reverent, like the name in his head wasn't something you said out loud without earning the right first. The rest of the team followed his gaze. Then slowly, every eye turned to Lane 13. The forgotten lane. The ghost lane. And for the first time that morning, even the instructors stopped pretending they knew who they were dealing with. Reyes crossed the concrete slowly, his boots silent against the pitted surface. He moved like a man stepping through memory, not space. Like each yard brought him closer to something he wasn't sure he deserved to see again. His team hung back instinctively, sensing this wasn't their place. Even the other instructors paused, whatever half-hearted posturing they were doing. Conversations died in throats. Laughter dissolved into silence. Lane 13 had gone from a punchline to a pressure point. Lorna stood in profile, eyes still on her target downrange, unaware or pretending to be. The breeze tugged at the loose edge of her sleeve, just enough to uncover that tattoo again. Reyes stopped a few feet short, his gaze resting there before lifting to her face. "Ma'am." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through everything. The wind, the weight of unspoken questions, the disbelief building around them. There was no mockery in his tone, no curiosity. Just quiet reverence threaded with disbelief. "Ma'am, is that you?" Everything stopped. The breeze, the idle shuffling of gear. Even the buzz of the overhead lights felt muted, like the world had leaned in to hear her answer. Lorna didn't turn right away. Just lowered her rifle, checked the safety, and rested it against the stand with care. When she finally faced him, her expression was unreadable, not cold-contained. "Chief," she said simply. A name, a memory, a confirmation. That was all Reyes needed. He snapped to attention, not theatrically, not out of obligation, but with a suddenness born of recognition. He raised his hand to his brow, held the salute sharp and unwavering. Like he was honoring more than a person, like he was saluting a moment in history only the two of them truly understood. The range didn't breathe. Morales blinked twice, unsure of what he was witnessing. Hendricks looked down at his clipboard like it might provide context. It didn't. The young corporal near the checkout desk spilled half his coffee on his boot and didn't even flinch. Nobody said anything. Because suddenly, every assumption made that morning felt too small to matter. The woman on Lane 13 wasn't a contractor anymore. She was something else entirely. Reyes let his salute fall, slowly, like he was reluctant to let go of whatever reverence had held it in place. He looked at Lorna one last time, then turned toward the range staff, toward the instructors, who still hadn't managed to piece together how their morning had gone sideways. Hendricks opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. Morales stood stiff, arms crossed tight across his chest, like posture alone could protect him from what he was about to hear. Reyes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You know who that is? They shook their heads, almost in unison. Hesitation thick in the air. A simple answer, but the kind that carried consequence. Because now, they were no longer mocking a stranger. Now they were ignorant in front of someone who mattered. Reyes took a breath through his nose. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. Just grounding the moment in something real. "That's Sergeant First Class Briggs," he said. "Shadow Company." The name hit harder than anything shouted ever could. Two simple words, said flat and low, but with the weight of memory and reputation behind them. Hendricks blinked fast. Morales looked over at Lorna again, as if seeing her for the first time. 4 confirmed solo extractions, Reyes continued. No spotter, no drone coverage. Terrain intel scraped together from satellite photos and rumors. He took a step closer to them. Voice even, almost clinical now. 1. Man overwatch in the Hindu Kush. Held off a Taliban flank for 7 hours, so we could evac wounded. Rain, fog, no comms, just math, timing. And in 110 she tuned herself. She wrote the doctrine we still use, he said, glancing over his shoulder at Lorna. Camouflage patterning, shot tempo, forced breathing under duress. She taught the first 5 classes of forward recon instructors while most of you were still figuring out your bootlaces. Reyes turned back to the others, his eyes steadier than ever. She's why my team is still alive. No one moved. No one spoke. The truth had entered the space like a stone into water, rippling out and knocking down every illusion they'd built around Lane 13. Lorna stood there like the eye of a storm still, steady, unmoved by the growing swirl around her. Reyes's words lingered in the dry air, but she didn't bask in them, didn't let them settle on her shoulders like a crown. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, almost tired, and let out a faint breath through her nose. "I was just good at math," she said, voice low, like it wasn't meant for more than the space between her and Reyes. It wasn't humility. It was the truth, shaped by years of repetition and distance. It was how she had learned to survive the gravity of what she'd done by reducing it to numbers, calculations, angles of fire and wind drift, the quiet math of life and death. But Reyes didn't let it go. "No, ma'am," he said gently, shaking his head, the respect in his voice cutting through the silence. "You were a ghost. A guardian angel." He looked at the instructors again, then back at her. "And most of us only made it home because you were on the scope." That was the kind of praise that didn't require applause. The kind that came from men who knew exactly what it meant to bleed for every inch of survival. And it settled into the air like scripture final, unarguable. The other SEALs, silent until now, began to close in, not to crowd her, not to corner her, but to be near her. They moved in a loose half-circle, shoulder to shoulder, forming a kind of unspoken perimeter around Lane 13. No one said a word. They didn't need to. These were men who'd survived firefights and call-outs, who'd memorized the rhythms of combat like verses. And now, without orders or ceremony, they stood around Lorna Briggs the way warriors do when they recognize one of their own, not just for who she was, but for everything she carried in silence. No medals, no salute, no fanfare. Just quiet. Just presence. Because some legends don't speak. They don't boast. They don't correct the record. They just show up, hit center mass, and walk away. The sun had shifted by the time the range shut down. Shadows stretched longer across the concrete, softening the hard edges of the morning's bravado. The laughter that once echoed between the barriers had long since evaporated, replaced by something heavier, something reverent. Lorna stood at the checkout desk, the same one where the corporal had barely looked up hours earlier. Now he couldn't meet her eyes. His hands moved fast and careful as he took her weapon, double-checked the serial, and handed her the clipboard. She signed her name without comment. Just another line in a box. Just another day on paper. The target sheet, the one with her final string. 10 shots so tight they looked punched from the same hole, rested on the table next to the logbook. Someone, maybe Reyes, maybe nobody in particular, had set it aside. It hadn't been requested, but it didn't matter. Morales quietly pulled a sheet of laminate film from the office drawer and pressed it down, sealing the grouping in plastic like preserving a relic. No one spoke while he pinned it to the wall. Center column. Eye level. Top of the board. Back near the armory, Hendricks stood at the corkboard, where they kept the joke list paper scraps, with names of shooters who missed laughably bad, usually with crude sketches or mocking notes scrawled in Sharpie. Lorna's name had been up there once. It wasn't now. Hendricks pulled the page down and crumpled it slowly in his hand, not even bothering to smooth the wrinkles first. He didn't post anything in its place. Some names didn't belong in the rotation. Some names belonged elsewhere. She walked past the next round of arrivals without a word. New contractors. Weekend reservists. Some with fresh patches. Some were too young to know how close they were to their first mistake. But none of them spoke, at least not until she passed the youngest one, the same kid who'd laughed about curling irons and flip phones. His voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. "Ma'am, were you really Shadow Company?" Lorna didn't stop walking, didn't turn. But just before the gate swallowed her silhouette, she gave the faintest smile. "We all were," she said, "for a while," and then she was gone.